Welcome. You're listening to LatinWaves with your hosts Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. LatinWaves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I am delighted to be joined by Jorge Martin. He's the secretariat of Hands Off Venezuela. Welcome to our program, Jorge.
It's a pleasure to be with you again.
One of the things that has been in the backdrop has been the imperial aggression that continued throughout COVID, whether it be with sanctions against Venezuela, whether it be the complete silence against the violence in Colombia against workers and people uprising in Colombia, whether it be, simply the millions of people who die from hunger every day, far more than from, the virus. So now we are seeing a very aggressive campaign, not just to exacerbate the violence against one country that has been for decades aggressed by the imperial powers of the U.S., Cuba. So can you paint a picture of what's going on and why now?
In order to explain the situation in Cuba, you have to have an understanding of a few basic facts that come before what's happening now. But let's start with what is happening now. What's happening now is basically on the 11th of July, on Sunday, there was a protest in the town of San Antonio de los Baños, which is about 25 kilometers southwest of the capital, Havana. And a number of people, a few hundred, perhaps 200 people came out on the streets. They were protesting. And the immediate cause for this protest was twofold. One, there have been a series of power cuts in the town, and not only in the town, in other towns and cities across Cuba, and the people in San Antonio de los Baños were worried about this, and they started circulating a call for a demonstration on social media, and these power cuts have been quite damaging. In some cases, they've been going on for 6 hours a day, and obviously it makes everyday life very difficult. The cause for these power cuts is there are several causes, but one of the causes is a fault at a nearby power station, and the fact that the government has found it very difficult to import the necessary parts in order to repair this electricity plant. So this is not a usual occurrence. It's an unusual thing, and that's why people were coming out on the streets, and also some of the people out in the streets in San Antonio were shouting, "We want vaccines, we want vaccines." And it is also the case that in the last 10 days, perhaps 2 weeks, there has been a sharp increase in the number of COVID cases in Cuba. Cuba had controlled the pandemic in a very effective way by implementing measures of social distancing. Anyone who tested positive was taken to a quarantine center funded by the state. And in general, Cuba has a very good health system. They managed to keep the COVID pandemic under control for 14 months.
It's important to note that, despite the severe situation with the blockade, the number of cases and death of COVID death are far below in Cuba than they are in other countries, including the U.S. Exactly. In
fact, Cuba is one of the countries anywhere in the world which has had the lowest number of people dying from COVID. And it's the lowest in Latin America. Not only this, but also Cuba has developed 2 vaccines, which are now going to be approved, homegrown vaccines through the Cuban biomedical industry, and has already vaccinated 15% of the population. But at the same time, something happened about 10 days ago. It seems with the arrival of some Russian tourists and so on, that the Delta variant arrived in the island, and as we know, the Delta variant is much more contagious, And this led to local outbreaks of the COVID pandemic, particularly in the province of Matanzas, which put the health sector, health service in that province under a lot of strain. So you can say that some of the people were genuinely worried, and they wanted to come out on the streets and then address their grievances or their complaints or their worries to the local authorities. And that's neither here nor there. It's not a bad thing. But there are a number of other elements. One, I will say, is the fact that for days before this protest, there had been a concerted campaign on social media against Cuba. And this campaign was organized around the hashtag SOS Cuba. Basically, it was trying to exaggerate the COVID outbreak in Cuba. They were spreading false information about the situation in Matanzas, in the province of Matanzas. They said the local hospital has no electricity. People are dying because there's no electricity. There's COVID patients out in the corridors dying. And all of this was not true. The situation is not very good. There's been a big outbreak in Matanzas, but the situation was not as it was being painted. So the idea was to create a situation of panic and anxiety amongst the people who were receiving this news. And also then this was combined with the idea that Cuba needed a humanitarian intervention. And they basically roped in a number of artists, famous people, and so on, to basically get behind this SOS Cuba hashtag. And obviously demanding a humanitarian intervention in Cuba is completely scandalous on the part of the United States. The United States is creating, if anything, a humanitarian crisis in Cuba by blockading and embargoing the country in the middle of a pandemic. Like, just to give you one example, 1 year ago, the Chinese multimillionaire Jack Ma, the owner of Alibaba, sent shipments, sent plane loads of different of ventilators and other anti-COVID material to a number of Latin American countries and even European countries. It wasn't just Cuba. But in the case of Cuba, this material never arrived because the shipment, the cargo, was supposed to be transported by Avianca Cargo, a Colombian-based airline. And they said that they didn't feel safe because of U.S. sanctions, i.e. An airline in a third country was afraid of the U.S. imposing sanctions on them for transporting cargo from China to Cuba, i.e. not even going through the United States. So that just gives you an example. But anyway, there was this campaign. And this campaign there's an expert in Spain that has analyzed this campaign. And this was started from half a dozen Twitter accounts, which were on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. They were posting millions of tweets, several tweets a second. So this is obviously an operation. This is very well organized and financed with the aim of undermining the sovereignty of Cuba, creating a situation of panic. And we know that in the past, for instance, in Venezuela, this idea of a humanitarian crisis was used to justify foreign intervention. So, but I will say that this played a part in these protests. I.e., the people in San Antonio came out and they said, some people, a few hundred, came out and said, we want vaccines. Why did they say that? Because they thought the situation was much worse than what really was. So that's one factor. But on the other hand, it is true to say that the situation in Cuba is very bad. There's a really deep economic crisis, which has been aggravated, one, by Trump's sanctions, which have not been lifted by Biden, which I want to talk a bit more about perhaps later, and two, by the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic has affected Cuba in a very particular way. Cuba gets a lot of its hard foreign currency reserves from tourism, about $3 billion a year. And last year, there were no tourists. From April, when the country was closed down because of the pandemic, there were no tourists, and tourists have not yet even returned to Cuba. So a whole year worth of tourism has been lost for the Cuban economy, $3 billion. That's a lot of money. In fact, Cuba imports a year about $2 billion of food products, which has been unable to. So this has led, in turn, to a big scarcity of basic products, of medicines, and it's aggravated the situation that was already not very good before.
Yes, I want to talk about the history, why Cuba poses such a threat to the capitalist system of the United States, and that seems to be governing the whole world. Why can a tiny little island be such a threat to them?
But yeah, going back onto the history, I mean, the reason is very simple to understand. In 1959, Cuba had a revolution. And this revolution was mainly about two things. One, about the Cuban people deciding their own future free from U.S. Imperialist intervention. Ever since Cuba gained independence in 1898, it stopped being a colony of the Spanish Empire, and it became a colony of the U.S. It was formally independent, but the United States intervened militarily on several occasions. They were putting and taking out presidents, and there was even a thing called the Platt Amendment, which was in the Cuban Constitution, that legalized U.S. military intervention in the island when it felt that its interests were threatened. So I mean, that is the real situation. So when the Cuban Revolution was, one, about freeing themselves from U.S. interference and becoming free, really free, and second was about improving the lot of the majority of the people, the workers, the peasants, the poor, who were living in very bad conditions prior to the revolution, while the island was the brothel of the United States and was dominated by United States multinationals and United States mafia gangs. As you can see in the film, The Godfather, where it's very well represented. So this is the reason. They had a revolution for these two reasons, for national independence and for social liberation. And at the beginning, this revolution was not against capitalism. This was not in the program of the Cuban revolutionaries in 1959. But as soon as they started taking measures, decisive measures against U.S. imperialism and in favor of the people, for instance, agrarian reform, or for instance, the lowering of the price of the telephone tariffs or the electricity tariffs, they found that the majority of the sugarcane plantations were owned by U.S. companies, that the electricity company was owned by a U.S. multinational, that the telephone company was owned by a U.S. multinational. So progressively, as they were advancing in a very wide-ranging social reform program, they were infringing on the property rights of United States companies. And very soon, by 1962, just by carrying out a social program, they had abolished capitalism. They had expropriated all of the capitalists, which were in the main U.S.-based capitalists and the local puppets. So a small island, 90 miles from the United States, the most powerful imperialist country on earth, had carried out a socialist revolution. And not only this, but through this socialist revolution, they managed to massively increase the living standards of the population. For instance, in relation to health care, in relation to education, there was a program to abolish illiteracy, which they did in a very short space of time. In Cuba, university education is free of charge, very open to everyone. You don't end up your university years with a massive student debt hanging from your neck, and many other things. One of the first things that the revolution did already in '59 was to abolish rents. And tenants became the owners of the flats they'd been paying rent in for a long period of time. So all of these massive conquests of the Cuban Revolution were possible because of socialism, and they were a threat to the United States. Why? Because the conditions of Cuba were, and still are, the conditions of many of the Latin American countries. And so Cuba provided the threat of a good example, the threat of what was possible if you freed yourself from imperialist control, and if you abolished capitalism, things could massively improve for workers and peasants. And this was an example to follow for millions of workers, peasants, and poor across Latin America and beyond across the world. So this is the reason why the United States, from the very beginning, under Democrat and Republican administrations, has tried to put an end to the Cuban Revolution. There's been dozens of assassination attempts against Fidel Castro, who's obviously now dead. But as long as he was alive, they wanted to kill him. And there's been a very cruel and sadistic, I will say, embargo on Cuba, which was imposed in 1960. In 1962 is when the embargo started. And ever since, the United States administrations have tried to strangle the Cuban Revolution and overthrow it, and they have failed. This is another thing that riles with them. They've not been able to carry out their designs. So this is very important. If you don't understand this, you can't understand anything that's happening in Cuba today. This is the basis of the whole situation. And this embargo has been tightened by Trump. In fact, the Trump administration introduced 243, I think it is, 243 new measures to strengthen the embargo, which had been partially eased under the Obama administration. But for instance, the last measure that Trump took before he left office was to sanction, to introduce some financial sanctions that made it impossible for Western Union, which was carrying remittances from Cubans in the U.S. to their families in Cuba. This is no longer possible. And Western Union closed its operations in the island in December last year. This is another massive blow to the Cuban economy and to the Cuban people.
Now, I think it's important to note that worldwide, Cuba has been supported, and there has been a call from the United Nations with votes consistently, majority versus 2, the United States and Israel, who vote against removing the sanctions against Cuba. Can we talk a little bit about this and the significance this has?
Yeah, 20 years now that the United Nations General Assembly has voted consistently since 1992. They voted every year a resolution against the embargo, against the U.S. embargo on Cuba, which they declared. This resolution declares it as illegal. And this resolution has increased its support in the United Nations General Assembly to a point where about 10 years ago, everyone was voting in favor with 2 votes against. That is the United States and Israel, and perhaps 2 or 3 abstentions. This year, this vote was taken, I think about a month ago, and only 3 countries abstained. These countries were, Ukraine, Colombia, and Brazil. And 2 voted against, that is the U.S. and Israel, as you said. This means that 180, can't remember, 185 or 86 voted in favor of this, including allies of the United States in Europe, Canada itself. I mean, the thing is so scandalous that the U.S. has become completely isolated. However, as we know, the United Nations is no more than a talking shop. If they pass a resolution which is against the United States will ignore it. And if the United States manages to pass a resolution in its favor, then they will use the United Nations as a cover for their imperialist designs, which they have done on many occasions. But nevertheless, it shows how scandalous this embargo is, and the strength of the body of opinion that exists amongst the nations of the world against it. I mean, this is every year there is a massive defeat for the United States policy at the United Nations General Assembly on this question.
At the heart of it really is, do workers have a right to organize themselves and have a system other than capitalism to run their affairs? And how do we as workers unite in a way that, we have a clear and, a clear stance against what moving beyond capitalism means for us?
Yes, I mean that's the crucial question. I think this is the reason why they are so adamant to destroy the Cuban revolution, because the Cuban revolution shows that in Cuba the private profit motive running the economy doesn't exist. The economy is run on different grounds, and this is what allows them to provide health care and education for all. And also, for instance, the fact that they have this medical industry that has developed 2 vaccines. I mean, which other country of a similar economy size, similar size as Cuba, economy-wise, has developed 2 vaccines? Why? Because they have decided, it's a conscious decision to invest money in developing a medical industry and a drug pharmaceutical industry. While in the rest of the world, the pharmaceutical industry is in private hands and is based on making profits. In Cuba, it's based on developing drugs that can cure people, that can be useful for people. I will say, however, that the system in Cuba has many faults, deficiencies, and I wouldn't necessarily say that the workers are in control completely. No, in Cuba there are bureaucratic deficiencies in the system, but these deficiencies are also partly caused by the fact that this is a revolution isolated in a small island in a sea of capitalism, of hostile capitalism. And in any case, these deficiencies, which do exist in Cuba, will not be solved by overthrowing the revolution. As I said before, the reason why people have come out on the streets is because the situation is bad. But nevertheless, the people who are capitalizing these protests is the reaction, is the counter-revolution. And they started with slogans like "down with the dictatorship," "down with communism." And if this happens, if the revolution is overthrown, then the situation will not be better for the masses. It will be worse. First of all, free healthcare and education will be abolished, destroyed. The conquest of the revolution will be destroyed. And the poor people, many of whom were in these protests, will be the ones to pay for this. If you wanna see what Cuba will be if capitalism is restored, you just need to look at Haiti or the Dominican Republic, which are in the neighboring island, where the majority of the population live in extreme poverty under U.S. domination. That's what capitalist Cuba will look like. So that is very serious situation. The other thing is that the mass media internationally have magnified these protests, which I will say were significant. Let's be clear. These were the biggest protests against the government in Cuba, perhaps since 1994, and they were more widespread geographically than the ones in 94. However, we have to think about the exact proportions of this. For instance, in Havana, which is a city perhaps of 2-3 million people, about 2,000 or 3,000 came out on the streets to demonstrate. That is not the people of Cuba protesting against the government. It's a section of people came out, yes, to protest. But what the media also don't tell you internationally is the fact that there were protests, there were people who came out on the streets to defend the revolution. The President Diaz-Canel said, look, this is a very serious situation, and I call on revolutionaries, I call on communists to come out on the streets, defend the revolution. And there were large numbers, which you haven't seen on your television screens or on your newspapers. Or rather, I will say you have seen them, because the point is that many of the international media outlets have used images and pictures of pro-government demonstrations, pro-revolution demonstrations, to illustrate their stories, exaggerated stories about protests against the government. And you can see this very easily, because you can even see July 26 movement banners in some of these pictures. And the July 26 movement is the movement of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara that started the revolution in 1959. So they're also manipulating the information. And this is not a question of the people versus the Cuban government. No, in Cuba there are many different opinions, and there's a large body of people who are in favor of the revolution, who understand that the situation is not very good, the situation is very serious from an economic point of view, but that overthrowing the revolution will not solve anything. That the revolution needs to be defended, and yes, it needs to be improved, perfected, made better, but they are prepared to defend the revolution if anyone tries to overthrow it by force, and particularly if behind these forces is U.S. Imperialism. The Cubans are very proud of the sovereignty, of the independent stance, and of their revolution, and they're quite prepared to defend it. So yeah, the image that we're being fed by the mass media for their own reasons is completely distorted.
For many in Latin America, we are very familiar with the type of democracy the U.S. delivers. The type of democracy that brings multiple military bases, that choke the land, multiple mine sites, mining sites or exploitation. In the case of Haiti, as you point out, the U.S. intervention has meant an IMF program that meant lowering their labor wages even more. It meant a regime of hunger and constant atrocities that have been committed.
Not only that, in Haiti, every time the people have tried to elect a government that was in their favor, like the government of Aristide, this government has been overthrown by a U.S.-backed military coup, and Aristide was sent into exile, and others before him were killed. And the reign of terror that exists now in Haiti is U.S.-made, quite clearly.
Yeah.
Or Colombia, just you were talking at the beginning about Colombia. In Colombia, there's been massive protests since the end of April, and over 60 people have been killed. Thousands have been attacked by the police and severely injured. There's been cases of sexual assault of women by the police forces. And this is supposed to be a democracy, however. And then they turn to Cuba and they say, "Oh, this is a very nasty dictatorship." But I mean, this is just the double standards of U.S. imperialism. Today, for instance, or yesterday, I think it was, Biden said that he was not prepared to allow remittances to be sent to Cuba again. And if you think about it, the remittances is not money that Cubans in Florida, for instance, send to the government. No, they send this money to their own families so that they can have some income in a very difficult situation. So he refused to lift the blockade or the embargo on the remittances, and the idea is very clear. The idea is we'll starve you to death, we'll choke you economically, so that then you blame your own government for this situation. This is like it's a completely callous blackmail that they are subjecting the people of Cuba to. As Diaz-Canel said very clearly, if you're really worried about the situation in Cuba, and the situation in Cuba is harsh, first thing you should do is lift the embargo. Mm-hmm. That is one of the main causes for this situation.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
We've come to the end of our show, LatinWaves. LatinWaves is an internationally syndicated weekly program made available through campus and community stations and available out to the world at www.latinwavesmedia.com.